Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are hidden in plain sight. A photograph from 1875 lay forgotten in an attic for nearly 150 years. But when a researcher finally zoomed in on a small detail, everything changed. What he discovered wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. And the truth he revealed would force historians to rewrite what they thought they knew about the people who risked everything to fight injustice when the world looked away. Before continuing, subscribe and like the video Pripios. This story needs to be told.
The estate sale in rural Pennsylvania promised nothing remarkable. A modest farmhouse built in 1868 belonging to a woman with no living relatives was being cleared before demolition. Marcus Rivera, a furniture restorer from Philadelphia, arrived searching for antique pieces. What he discovered in the attic would consume the next 8 months of his life. Behind a broken rocking chair, beneath layers of dust, sat a rusted metal lockbox. Inside, wrapped in yellowed oilcloth, was a collection of early photographs from the 1860s and 1870s. Most showed stern-faced families frozen in time, typical of the era. But one image stopped Marcus completely. 6 people stood before a simple wooden farmhouse. The parents wore formal 1870s clothing, the father in a dark suit with watch chain, the mother in a high-collared dress. 3 white children stood between them, ages ranging from perhaps 5 to 12. And beside the eldest daughter stood a black child, no more than 8 years old, wearing clothing identical in quality to the others. His hand rested naturally on the girl's shoulder. He wasn't positioned at the frame's edge or slightly behind. He stood fully integrated, as central as any blood relative. Marcus understood immediately why this was extraordinary. In 1875, during the violent backlash against black freedom and the rise of Jim Crow, photographs showing this kind of racial integration simply didn't exist in private collections. This suggested something far more complex than a simple portrait. That evening, Marcus photographed the image and began examining it on his computer. He zoomed in methodically, the weathered house, the formal clothing, each face. Then he focused on the black child's left sleeve. There, embroidered just above the cuff, was a small geometric pattern. 3 interlocking diamonds, each containing a star, with lines extending outward like compass points. Too precise to be random decoration, too deliberate to be meaningless. Marcus zoomed closer until the pattern filled his screen. His hands stopped moving. His breath caught. He recognized what he was seeing. This photograph wasn't just a family portrait. It was a confession, a declaration, a piece of evidence that would unlock a story of extraordinary courage hidden for nearly 150 years. Marcus spent the entire night searching digital archives and academic databases. The coffee pot emptied twice as darkness shifted to dawn. Finally, buried in a 1987 Smithsonian research paper, he found confirmation. Dr. Eleanor Price, a historian specializing in textile communication systems, had written a controversial thesis. The Underground Railroad hadn't ceased after the Civil War. Instead, the network evolved throughout Reconstruction, helping formerly enslaved people escape escalating violence, reunite with separated families, and reach safe communities. And they developed new codes. The 3 interlocking diamonds, called the beacon, indicated a household actively participating in the network. The stars inside each diamond represented capacity. 3 stars meant space for 3 people at a time. But displaying such a symbol openly, particularly in a photograph that could be reproduced, represented reckless defiance. These networks operated in absolute secrecy. Conductors used code names. Safe houses were known only to trusted contacts. Discovery could mean violence or murder. Why would a family risk exposing themselves this way? Marcus studied the photograph again. The positioning, the clothing quality, the black child's expression. Calm, even slightly proud. This wasn't accidental. Someone had deliberately created a permanent record, consequences be damned. Dr. Price's footnotes referenced primary sources held at Haverford College, including papers from a family named Whitmore. Marcus checked the estate sale location, 12 miles from Haverford. The timeline matched. He called the college's archives department. Yes, they held the Whitmore family papers, including a diary kept by Ruth Whitmore from 1872 to 1889. Marcus made an appointment for the next day. He couldn't sleep, returning constantly to the photograph, to the boy's face, wondering who he was and how his life became entwined with this white family during one of America's most violent periods. The answer would prove far more complex and heartbreaking than he imagined. The leather-bound diary sat before Marcus, its pages yellowed but intact. He opened carefully to January 1st, 1872, and began reading Ruth Whitmore's precise handwriting. Early entries documented routine farm life, weather, crops, neighbors. But interspersed were references that quickened Marcus's pulse. Arrivals at midnight, supplies hidden in the cellar, careful watch on the roads. Ruth never used explicit language, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Whitmores operated a safe house. Entries from 1872 and early 1873 referenced multiple families passing through, staying nights or weeks before continuing north. Ruth noted their fear, exhaustion, traumatized children. She documented Thomas Whitmore's increasing concern about surveillance and escalating violence. Then, August 14, 1873, changed everything. Ruth described a boy, approximately 6 years old, appearing alone at their door near midnight, filthy, barefoot, terrified. He carried nothing except a fabric scrap sewn into his coat lining, embroidered with their address. His name was Samuel. His mother had put him on a wagon north from North Carolina 3 weeks earlier. Armed men stopped the wagon. Samuel hid beneath supplies, escaped detection, then remained hidden. When the wagon reached Harrisburg, he slipped away and began walking. Nearly 30 miles, alone, 6 years old. Ruth described cleaning his infected feet, his whispered speech, his flinching at movement. Then she recorded the decision that would define Samuel's childhood. They wouldn't send him onward. He would remain. He would become their son. Subsequent entries traced Samuel's integration. First words above a whisper, first smile, nightmares, gradual trust. Their daughter Mary teaching him letters, but Ruth also documented the cost. Hostile neighbors, merchants refusing service, trader painted on their barn, threatening letters. The Whitmores didn't waver. By December 1873, Samuel had become family. He helped with chores, played with the children, asked endless questions. March 3rd, 1875. Thomas decided to commission a family portrait. The decision wasn't made lightly. Photographs were expensive, and this would create permanent evidence of their defiance. Ruth's final entry before the photographer arrived. Thomas has asked that I embroider the beacon onto Samuel's sleeve. I argued against such visibility, but he believes the truth should be documented. Let history judge us. The photograph session occurred March 10th, 1875. Traveling photographer William Archer charged 50 cents per sitting, unaware of what he was documenting. Ruth described the preparation meticulously. She bathed all children the night before, pressed their best clothing, and sat by candlelight embroidering the 3 interlocking diamonds onto Samuel's sleeve, each stitch carrying unbearable weight. That morning, the family assembled before their house. Cold March weather, clear skies. Thomas positioned everyone carefully, himself on one side, Ruth opposite, children arranged between by height. Samuel stood beside Mary, his first friend and most dedicated teacher. Archer prepared his camera, coating the glass plate with collodion, instructing absolute stillness. Any movement would blur the image during the several-second exposure. Ruth watched Samuel during those frozen moments. He stood straighter than ever, hand resting on Mary's shoulder exactly as positioned. Serious, but unafraid. For those seconds captured in chemistry and glass, he looked like what he'd become, a child who belonged. 2 weeks later, Archer delivered the photograph. He made no comment about the family's composition. Either he didn't notice or understood silence was the price of business in divided communities. Thomas immediately framed it and hung it in the parlor, visible to anyone entering. A statement, a challenge, a declaration made visible, but consequences came swiftly. Within days, men from town appeared at the farm, shouting accusations from the road, betraying his race, corrupting his children, defying natural order. They promised a reckoning. Thomas stood on the porch, rifle visible but not raised, and told them to leave. Violence arrived gradually. Cut fences, trampled crops, their horse found dead with its throat cut. No proof, but everyone knew. Through it all, Ruth documented Samuel's growth, fluent reading, helping repair fences, questions about his mother, where she might be, whether she was alive, if she thought about him. These questions haunted Ruth. They'd given Samuel safety, education, love, but they couldn't give him what he needed most, knowledge of his origins, and whether his mother searched for him. Then, early 1876 brought changes Ruth never predicted. February 9th, 1876. Heavy snow falling. A knock at the door. Thomas answered to find a black woman on the porch, clothing worn thin, face gaunt with exhaustion and desperate hope. She asked, barely whispering, whether they were the Whitmores, whether they'd taken in a boy named Samuel, whether he was still alive. Ruth wrote that time stopped. Thomas called for Samuel, who ran from the kitchen. The woman saw him, and her composure shattered completely. She spoke his name, just his name, and Samuel froze. He stared, mind processing, then recognition sparked. He ran to her with a cry Ruth described as a heart simultaneously breaking and healing. Her name was Caroline. She'd been searching 3 years. Over following days, Caroline told her story in fragments. Enslaved in North Carolina, she'd raised Samuel from birth in 1867. When emancipation rumors reached the plantation, the owner threatened to sell them separately. A Quaker woman helped arrange Samuel's escape on a wagon north, giving Caroline the Whitmore address, but Caroline couldn't go, too closely watched. She promised Samuel she'd find him. made him memorize her name, put him on that wagon at midnight. Last time she saw him until now. After the wagon left, Caroline was sold to South Carolina as punishment. When Union soldiers liberated the area, she walked away with nothing. 3 years working any job available, saving every penny, following rumors. Someone in Harrisburg mentioned a white family who'd taken in a black child. She walked through snow and freezing rain, desperate that her son might still live. And he was. Ruth watched them together, something breaking open in her chest. Samuel clung to his mother as if she might vanish. Caroline held him, weeping soundlessly, hands trembling as they traced his face. But beneath reunion joy, Ruth recognized complex truth emerging. Samuel had been 6 at separation, now 9. Half his life with the Whitmores. No memory of his mother's face, only loss he couldn't articulate. Now she was here, real, asking him to remember who he'd been. The unspoken question hung impossibly. What happens now? Following weeks documented a situation with no precedent, no easy answer. Caroline had found her son, but nothing else. No home, no steady income, no way to provide for a child accustomed to safety and education. Ruth wrote about their kitchen conversation while Samuel played outside. Caroline spoke with devastating honesty. She'd dreamed of this reunion for 3 years, imagining the life they'd build. But reality was harsher. She worked dawn to dusk for wages barely keeping her alive, moving between boarding houses or sleeping in church basements. She asked Ruth a question that clearly cost everything. Could Samuel stay with them? Ruth told Caroline that Samuel belonged with his mother, their bond sacred. But she proposed an alternative honoring both Caroline's love and Samuel's stability needs. Thomas and Ruth would house Samuel weekdays for continued schooling. Caroline would work in town, living in a room above the Methodist church. Every Sunday, Caroline would visit the farm. They'd share meals, have time together. When Caroline saved enough for a proper home, Samuel would go with his mother, imperfect and painful, asking Caroline to delay her hard-won reunion, asking Samuel to navigate 2 families, 2 identities, but the best solution available. Caroline agreed, weeping as she accepted, torn between gratitude and grief. The arrangement began the following week. Samuel attended school, helped with chores, slept in his room. But Sundays became sacred. Caroline arrived at dawn and Samuel transformed. Louder, more physical, more demonstrative. Ruth observed that with Caroline, Samuel allowed himself to be younger, more vulnerable. With the Whitmores, he'd learned to be careful, controlled, aware of how his presence challenged the world. Ruth documented Sunday dinners including both families. Thomas engaging Caroline in conversation about work and plans. Mary teaching Caroline to read with gentle patience. Younger Whitmore children accepting Caroline's presence naturally. Months passed. Small victories. Caroline's promotion to head laundress, earning cottage rent. Samuel's mathematics progress. Gradual easing of community hostility. Not acceptance, but grudging tolerance from the family's stubborn refusal to leave. Early 1878, Samuel asked whether he could have 2 mothers, whether loving Caroline meant he couldn't love Ruth, whether belonging to 2 families was possible. Thomas answered that love wasn't finite. Samuel's heart was large enough for everyone who cared for him. Family was defined by commitment and sacrifice, not blood. Samuel asked to call Ruth Mother Ruth and Caroline Mother Caroline. Both agreed immediately. But Ruth's private entry revealed complexity beneath composed exterior. She'd fallen in love with this child. Raising him had changed her understanding of family. Now she watched him build a relationship with his true mother, knowing eventually, rightfully, he would leave. She described it as loving someone enough to let them go, even as it tore you apart. By 1879, the political landscape had shifted drastically. Federal troops withdrew from the South, ending Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws spread, codifying segregation and disenfranchisement. Violence against black communities escalated. White families supporting racial equality faced severe consequences. Ruth documented the deterioration meticulously. The network operating throughout the 1870s began fragmenting. Conductors arrested on fabricated charges. Safe houses burned. Families who'd risked everything found themselves isolated and vulnerable. January 1880, violence reached the Whitmore farm directly. 15 men arrived at dawn with torches, surrounding the house, shouting accusations, demanding they surrender anyone hidden. Thomas met them at the door, rifle in hand but not raised, saying they'd find only family. The men didn't believe him. They forced through the house, overturning furniture, smashing dishes, searching for hidden spaces. Mary tried blocking the cellar stairs and was struck. Ruth wrote she'd never seen Thomas so close to violence, finger trembling on the trigger, before he lowered the weapon and ordered them out. They found nothing. Caroline and Samuel had been warned 2 days earlier and temporarily moved to Philadelphia. But before leaving, the raid leader, mill owner Hutchins, issued a warning. If the family continued harboring black people or assisting their settlement, there would be consequences beyond property damage. The following week, Thomas met with other network members. They made the painful decision to suspend operations. Risk had become too great, especially for families with children. 3 conductors killed in Virginia the previous month. The network couldn't function if maintaining it meant orphaning children or widowing spouses, but they agreed the network wouldn't disappear entirely. They'd maintain connections, keep symbols visible, wait for safer times. Thomas argued the work was generational. What they couldn't complete, their children would continue. For Samuel and Caroline, the raids accelerated inevitable transition. Caroline had saved enough to rent a Philadelphia cottage. She'd secured steady employment with Quaker abolitionists who paid fair wages and offered to pay for Samuel's schooling. February 28, 1880, Ruth described the farewell. Whitmore children weeping, Mary holding Samuel until the wagon was ready. Thomas giving him a small Bible with his name inscribed. Ruth giving Caroline a quilt with a beacon pattern stitched into corners, gift and reminder of the network that brought them together. Samuel asked whether he'd see them again. Thomas promised yes. Family didn't end because of distance. As the wagon pulled away, Samuel leaned out and waved until he disappeared. Ruth wrote that Caroline never looked back, perhaps because it hurt too much. The house felt empty. But Thomas reminded her that Samuel was alive, safe, reunited with his mother and educated. That was victory. That was what they'd fought for. Ruth's diary continued 9 more years, documenting family life, community's slow acceptance, gradual healing. But she never mentioned Samuel again by name until Marcus discovered what happened next. Marcus left Haverford with photocopies of 47 diary pages and a burning question. What happened to Samuel after 1880? A 9-year-old with that resilience, that intelligence, raised by 2 families who loved him. That child must have left a mark. He returned to Philadelphia and began painstaking historical research. Census records, city directories, church registries, school logs, death certificates, property deeds. Marcus worked through databases until his eyes burned, following threads nowhere, hitting dead ends, starting over. The challenge was Samuel's last name. The Whitmores hadn't formally adopted him, and Caroline's enslaved surname was likely her owner's name, possibly changed after emancipation. Marcus searched variations: Samuel Whitmore, Samuel Caroline, Samuel Freeman, Samuel Liberty. Names formerly enslaved people commonly chose. 3 weeks later, Marcus found a reference in Pennsylvania Abolition Society records. A June 1885 letter from Quaker educator Elizabeth Morris described her school's most promising student, Samuel Wright, age 14, who'd arrived in Philadelphia 5 years earlier with his mother, Caroline Wright. The letter noted Samuel's previous rural education and exceptional aptitude for mathematics and mechanical drawing. Elizabeth was requesting scholarship funds for technical school. Marcus's hands shook photographing the letter. He cross-referenced and found Samuel Wright in the 1885 Philadelphia directory, listed as a student at Morris School for Colored Youth. The 1890 census showed him at 19, employed as a draftsman at a machine manufacturing company. The trail strengthened. By 1895, Samuel had become a certified engineer, one of fewer than 20 black professional engineers in Pennsylvania. He'd married a teacher named Grace, had 2 children. The 1900 census listed him in a middle-class black neighborhood, owning his home, earning comfortable income. But what captured Marcus's attention was a 1903 Philadelphia Tribune notation. A brief article announced Samuel Wright's promotion to chief engineer at Baldwin Locomotive Works, one of America's largest industrial manufacturers. The article noted, this was unprecedented, the company's first black chief engineer. The accompanying photograph showed a confident man in his early 30s wearing a suit and wire-rimmed glasses, standing beside a massive locomotive engine. Marcus zoomed in, looking for traces of the frightened 6-year-old who'd walked 30 miles alone. There, barely visible, a small pin on Samuel's lapel. 3 interlocking diamonds. The beacon. He'd never stopped carrying it. Marcus spent 2 months assembling Samuel Wright's complete life story, piecing together fragments from newspapers, engineering journals, church records, and family histories. What emerged was extraordinary achievement built on love from 2 families. Samuel graduated from technical school in 1891 at age 20, the only black student in his class. His thesis on steam engine efficiency improvements was published in an engineering journal, gaining attention from manufacturers. Baldwin Locomotive Works hired him as junior draftsman, a position typically closed to black applicants, but his work was too exceptional to ignore. He rose through this company over 12 years, repeatedly encountering barriers, but producing designs that improved locomotive performance and safety. And by 1903, as chief engineer, he held 7 patents related to locomotive manufacturing. But Samuel's achievements extended beyond professional success. He and Grace opened their home to children from struggling families, providing education and support. Between 1898 and 1915, they helped over 30 children attend school, find apprenticeships, and establish themselves in skilled trades. In 1910, Samuel published a memoir titled 2 Mothers, One Journey. The book documented his experiences being raised by Caroline and the Whitmores, his observations about racial injustice, and his belief that change required both black excellence and white allies willing to sacrifice comfort for justice. Too controversial for major publishers, it was printed by a small black-owned press. Marcus obtained a digitized Library of Congress copy. Reading Samuel's words in his own voice was overwhelming. Samuel described arriving at the Whitmore farm in vivid detail. Fear, exhaustion, Ruth's gentle hands cleaning his infected feet. Learning to trust again. Mary teaching him letters. Thomas showing him fence repair, explaining that work done well was a form of dignity. But he also wrote about reuniting with Caroline, describing it as living underwater, then suddenly breaking the surface. He acknowledged the complexity of loving two families, guilt about being happy with the Whitmores while his mother searched, confusion about where he belonged. Samuel's solution: he didn't have to choose. Both families gave different gifts. The Whitmores gave education, safety, and understanding that white people could be justice allies. Caroline gave identity, connection to history, and proof that love could survive separation and trauma. He carried both gifts forward, using engineering skills to create opportunities for other black professionals while maintaining Whitmore family contact throughout his life. The memoir included letters exchanged between Samuel and Mary into adulthood, discussing politics, social change, shared memories. Samuel Wright died in 1932 at 61 from pneumonia. His Philadelphia Tribune obituary described him as a pioneering engineer, community leader, and living example of black American achievement when given opportunity. Hundreds attended the funeral, including 3 Whitmore family grandchildren. Marcus sat with this information for days, emotionally exhausted and profoundly moved. But one question remained. What happened to the photograph? How did it end up in that attic, seemingly forgotten? The answer led to the final puzzle piece. The estate sale had been for Dorothy Hughes, who died at 87 with no living children. Marcus obtained her death certificate and traced her family lineage backward. Dorothy was born Dorothy Whitmore in 1936, great-granddaughter of Thomas and Ruth, descended through their daughter Mary. The same Mary who'd taught Samuel to read, defended him during the raid, maintained lifelong correspondence with him. The house being demolished had been Mary's house, built in 1868 and passed through her family line. Dorothy was the last living descendant. The photograph had traveled from the original Whitmore farm to Mary's house after Thomas and Ruth died, kept as a family treasure for generations. But somewhere along the way, its meaning was lost. Dorothy's children, interviewed after Marcus contacted them, knew nothing about Samuel or the family's abolitionist activities. The photograph had become just an old picture, tucked away and forgotten, its radical message invisible to people who'd never learned to look for it. Marcus made a decision. He contacted Samuel Wright's descendants, still living in Philadelphia, and arranged a meeting. The gathering occurred on a Sunday afternoon in March 2024, almost exactly 149 years after the photograph was taken. Samuel's great-great-grandson, James Wright, a high school history teacher, opened his home's door. 15 family members had assembled. Marcus placed the photograph on the table. Profound silence settled. James Wright picked it up carefully, hands trembling. He'd heard stories about Samuel growing up with a white family, but never seen proof. Here was his ancestor as a child, standing with people who'd saved his life and shaped his future. A woman in her 70s, Samuel's great-granddaughter, pointed to the sleeve symbol. She explained that Samuel had passed down the beacon symbol to his children, teaching that it represented safe harbor and resistance. Her own grandmother had embroidered it into a quilt still hanging in her living room. Marcus spent 3 hours sharing Ruth's diary entries, newspaper articles about Samuel's achievements, documenting the connection between that 6-year-old refugee and the chief engineer, community leader, and author he became. The family decided to donate the photograph to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, along with Samuel's memoir and Marcus's documentation. It would become part of an exhibit about the Underground Railroad's continuation after the Civil War, about families resisting injustice at great cost, and about a child who carried 2 mothers' legacy forward into a life of achievement and service. Before Marcus left, James Wright thanked him for bringing Samuel home. Marcus shook his head. Samuel had never been lost, he said. His legacy lived in the family who remembered him, in lives he'd touched, in children he'd helped, in work he'd accomplished. The photograph had just been waiting for someone to zoom in and see what had always been there. Evidence that love could cross every boundary society erected, that courage could be quiet and persistent, that ordinary people could choose extraordinary defiance, and that one child, saved by strangers' compassion and reclaimed by his mother's fierce devotion, could change the world. The symbol on Samuel's sleeve, 3 interlocking diamonds, had meant safe harbor in 1875. Nearly 150 years later, it still meant the same thing. A reminder that in darkest times, some people choose to be light, and their choices echo forward, generation after generation, long after photographs fade and names are forgotten. Some secrets aren't meant to stay hidden. Some stories demand to be told. This was one of them.